prop itself. Essentially, veganism is an ethical obligation. I think is the prop we agreed to.
I think it was
So
moral, and
did I say
given
moral?
that I know that you hold the distinction, that might be relevant.
Yeah, I do hold the distinction. So did I say moral? Did I not say ethical? I said ethical, right?
Oh, okay. It's me who
Okay.
forgot.
Okay. Okay. So veganism is an ethical obligation. So the first, like, there's three terms I think that need to define there. I think we're pretty good with is and an. But ethical obligation and veganism. So ethics I take to be the study of value, essentially the study of how and if possible to achieve positive phenomenological experience and avoid negative phenomenological experience. Um, the Greeks taught this as how to live a good life. How to avoid doing harm is another question that's asked in this field, and I think from this, I think many of us understand ethics. Obligation I take to be essentially a point of justification. That if an individual is obligated, then they ought to do it, they should do it, or must do it to remain consistent. That they would be contradicting um, one of their original propositions or assertions. So it is an obligation for an individual to do the right thing in a circumstance, otherwise, he would be unjustified in doing it, is essentially what I'm arguing. And then in terms of veganism, I take it to be the vegan society definition, a philosophy or way of living which seeks to exclude as far as possible and practicable all forms of exploitation to and cruelty to and exploitation of animals for the what was it? Yeah, of animals, and then it's for the benefit of uh, animals, humans, and the environment. Now, I take that to be the definition of vegan, and I don't think veganism, and I don't think probably have any issues with that definition necessarily. So, in this case, when I say someone is obligated to be a vegan, what I mean is that they're obligated to not cause harm to another sentient being, as they would be in contradiction with their desire in the first place. So that when an individual acts based upon one of their desires, their first order desires, to consume an animal product. They are doing so with the intention of bringing around a positive phenomenological state. They inherently or implicitly hold a proposition that I want to do X will bring around Y, Y being a positive state of being. And that is entailed within their notion of desire. Their notion of desire is not simply an action urging process, it's an action urging process with reference to a telos. So there is an end inherent within an individual's action and intention. When they intend to do something, they intend to bring around a world in a certain way, to modify the world in a certain way, or in the words of Nietzsche, to discharge their strength against the world. Um, the contradiction I would say that occurs would be between the individual's desire to bring around positive phenomenological experience and their outcome, which is to increase harm and create more negative phenomenological experience. I intend to argue that an individual, if they accept that they have any desires whatsoever, already accepts that or already necessitates their moral obligation to at least themselves. And if they have an obligation to at least themselves, then they require the epistemological structure, which requires validation on notions and or for the creation of universals rather, which allows validation of notions such as good, bad, right, or wrong. And also, I would say that their ability to metaphysically divest to their own desires and wants is dependent upon the recognition of the other, which they are dependent upon. And so, if they assert any given definition or of good, bad, right, or wrong, they are essentially in error. They are essentially asserting something erroneously, fallaciously. They're not allowing it to be verified or falsified, in which case it's open to the principle of exposure. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, let's start with what I might take issue with there. First, I don't really have a problem with your definition of ethics. I can I can accept that. What I more have a problem with is your definition of obligation seemed a bit vague to me, in that you seem to say that it's both a matter of consistency, but also something one must do. So it's going to be important that I know which of those you sort of take an obligation to be. When I take obligation, like you said, it's something that you must do, but you don't have to do something that you're propositionally inconsistent with. And I think we would both agree that ontologically you can't be inconsistent. That's not a possible state of being.
Yeah, I would say that I take it to be a matter of consistency. That if you were to do something you should or ought not do, you would be inconsistent.
So, right. And then that would have to be propositionally, because the only thing that can be inconsistent is things that you say in reference to other things.
Well, I
Um,
would say that an individual asserts a proposition in relation to their action intention. Like I'd say that there's it's based on second order desires. So when an individual makes a decision, they have done so cognitively and not implicitly. They haven't acted without conscious intention. If they have, then there's been no free action involved and no proposition, in which case they're not morally or ethically accountable.
okay, well, I'm not sure that's really going to matter. I both think people act non-consciously all the time without reference to what thinking about it. They just go about certain things. If that somehow makes somebody morally unobligated during those moments, but only morally obligated during conscious moments, that's going to be tough to sort out. But even if they were consciously acting, you're going to have to show that that's a proposition that entails that negative phenomenological experiences other than your own um, are somehow in contradiction, because I can maybe buy into the egoistic view that your actions are for positive experiences of your own, but not always necessary that um, they increase phenomenological experiences overall. Uh, Additionally, I don't know that veganism actually does that. Problem being is that a lot of the stances I take, the welfarist stances, seem to be to increase states of nature to states of agriculture, which have higher positive phenomenological experiences. The only thing that changes is the length of a life, but the amount of experiences that are possibly positive could be, in fact, increased over veganism. The last problem is that the definition that you're using, the vegan society definition, has always been terrible. Possible and practical are never defined as anything other than reasonable. Reasonable is always just whatever somebody feels like doing and a line that they just feel like drawing. Um, if you were doing actually as far as possible and practical, you would be a Jainist or something like that. And that's given that you have a take on your own life, that your own life is actually worth more than the negative experiences that you might put out um, due to your own living your life. So, I mean, just by your own existence, you're going to be killing insects, perhaps polluting, and you have to have a way of saying my life is in fact worth more than those lives that have been lost. So there's a lot here that I would be looking for you to explain.
Yeah, so I suppose the best place to start would probably be where you just ended on the definition of possible and practicable. I would argue that possible means like obviously able, or implies can kind of scenario. If you can't do it, then you're not obligated to do it.
Sure.
Um,
Would you take that as physically possible, as in it's not possible to jump to the moon, but it
yeah,
is possible to sell all my possessions and go live in a
yeah,
cave?
I would, but then I would add practicable. Obviously, does not mean that.
Well,
Practicable
you know
means
what? It's not practical, it's practicable.
It's I said I was going to say it's practicable. I said practicable. I might be saying it wrong, but I
Yeah.
wasn't saying practical. Yeah, I know. It's, I don't. I pull people up on that as well. um, um, but the reason that I'd say the
Let
definition.
me just read practicable. Able to be done or put into practice successfully. Now, I
Yeah,
don't know how that's much different than the word possible.
Well, I would say that the word "able to be done" is in reference to as in whether it's kind of reasonable. I think you were right in the first time, whether it would be a reasonable requirement for someone to do it. And in that, I
Right.
would
Well,
say
but
that
not literally, right? Like able to be done just basically means possible. Put into practice successfully might mean that it's repeatable.
I think that it's as if it was if when it says like able to be done, I think that would be like a bit of a non-nuanced position of practicable, like practicable, from what I'm aware. Like from every time I've heard practicable, and at least in my understanding of its usage, which it might obviously be in the dictionary definition, but it's usually in reference to something that can be done within reason.
I think that's more practical, which is the word that they don't bother using.
See,
But
I
I
don't think.
actually think that's what they're trying to say.
See, I think practical means it means something different. I would say that like practical is more open to subjective interpretation rather than reason. So I would say like practical, like as in like the I think the reason that they're going for practicable there is to essentially show that an individual can have we can acknowledge value whilst also acknowledging that we may be unable to respect it to its utmost. An example would be if I was in a situation in which there was an individual trying to attack me and I shot them, or I'd say two individuals trying to attack me and I shot them to protect my own life. I would say that I was justified in doing so, even though I could respect the value of both of those agents. I could say that each of them, even though they were attacking me, had value. If I could have not shot them, it would be better that I had not. However, that if I had not shot them, I would be risking my own subjectivity, which I would argue is the basis of ethics and our engagement in ethics in the first place. That what we are respecting when we're talking about positive and negative phenomenological experience is the positive and negative phenomenological experience of an agent, of a subject. And so to reject the subjectivity of oneself is to essentially leave oneself open to any ethical exploitation. Someone could, so long as that there is a greater value, like let's say there was 10 people trying to kill you, and your only way out was to fight back and kill them, then you'd be morally obligated to die. I would argue that would essentially nullify ethics because it would defeat what Hegel calls the system of drives. So I would say that what ethics actually is the mediation of desires to create the best scenario that is possible in one's life. So I would say that the content of our desires, like as in the first
I
order,
think could we bring it back to the definition of veganism because I feel like
yeah,
you're
yeah,
gonna
because it's
go
yeah,
off.
this is going to end up go back in meta ethics. But the
Because
essentially,
yeah,
I would
yeah.
say that in terms of practicable, I would say what is reasonable for a subject to do within reference to their own value.
Uh-huh. Right. But then that becomes a line that anyone could draw anywhere, including eating meat.
Oh,
Now,
I absolutely disagree. I think that line is rational and can be drawn.
you think it can be drawn. Well, can you draw it in a set of actions that are allowed?
Do you mean can I give you a universal absolute? Absolutely not. But I can talk about various scenarios and how we should understand them in relation to the value propositions involved.
Can you give like a heuristic that people would actually be able to use to be able to judge which actions they're allowed to do?
Yeah, I would say that you're able, so long as you're able to maintain your own subjectivity, as in your ability to live a life that is free from, you know, um, I would say like suffering in the sense that like you're able, like for example, a lot of Jainists actually starve themselves to death, from what I'm aware. Um,
It's optional, and it's only if they want to.
it's optional, anyway. But it seems to be quite a logical extension of the ideology. Um, but the point I'm saying is that that's because they're not respecting their own subjectivity. They're respecting subjectivity simplicita, which does not include themselves. I'd say that there is a minimum expectation of an individual to have a life that is that pertains to a certain amount of liberty, and that liberty is essentially the capacity, for example, to live a life which is relatively free from suffering, as in not in a negative phenomenological state, and and I would say like a way to preserve their own life. So essentially, avoid harm to themselves and preserve their own life, and also avoid harm to others in that scenario. And that's it.
Uh-huh. So now if I suggested to someone that they should turn off their video games because that just pollutes the air, it could lead to some amount of detrimental effect on the environment, thus killing some animals, or not eat as much to gain, muscle because you don't need that to survive, and
Mhm.
all these different things, you might turn around and say, well, that might make that person very unhappy. They wouldn't be respecting their own subjectivity, right? Now,
Well,
of course,
there's a point of. I mean, we could also differentiate notions of unhappiness and, psychological like instability. So if someone becomes so depressed that they kill themselves, for example, or they become
sure,
yeah, and so on.
right? But I mean, that's going to be contingent on the individual, right?
Yeah,
Like
I
some
would agree.
person might be able to be fine without that. And then it
Fragility of the
seems that
individual.
the vegan message would say that for any person who could survive without those things should survive without those things. The next one,
I think it would probably be in relation to the amount of like subjectivity being expressed. So
yeah,
it's like,
well,
for
that's what I
example,
mean.
like
If
so for example, to take the life of another means that I would argue that it would only be reasonable for one to take that life if it was in respect of their own life. Um,
uh-huh.
because the value transaction would be unjustified. Like you couldn't just say it would make me sad and therefore I took that life.
Okay, but then isn't that what you're really advocating for when you say somebody can live a societal life that's, has certain luxuries in order for that person to remain at a positive phenomenal experience?
I'd
And
say
it has byproducts of animal deaths due to pollution and the stuff that humanity does.
well, I
You would
agree that
say that some people could do those things, wouldn't you? You're not advocating a Janus lifestyle.
yeah, I'm saying that there is like a limited expectation of like experience. If someone can only be expected to appreciate a certain standard of like diminished well-being in respect of other people. So, for
Right, but that
example,
well-being comes at a cost of things. You realize that, right?
oh yeah, yeah, I agree. But it's the point isn't necessarily to say like, for example, that one would not be morally obligated. It's just to say that the agent might be incapable of actually engaging within ethics because they would be in such a contradiction with themselves that they could not motivate themselves into an ethical scenario. Like it would
Yeah,
be like you'd be asking someone to essentially self harm.
uh-huh. But like I said, if there's somebody who contingently would be able to forego those sorts of luxuries and maintain a positive phenomenal experience,
Then they should, yes.
then they should. They should give up the video games. If they're
Yeah.
fine just frolicking around in the woods and it makes them happy, then they should be giving up all of the luxuries in the world.
If you could make an argument that it was more ethical to do so, then yeah.
Right. Well, it would be more ethical if they're positively experiencing life and they're not harming other things due to the fact that they've given up all these things.
Yeah,
Then,
like for example, like they managed to create a scenario which is respects positive experience greater, um, whilst maintaining their own positive experience. Then yes.
and what about the person who is so upset by giving up meat that they couldn't engage within ethics? They're just that big of a crybaby.
I would say that the way that we should engage with that individual isn't necessarily to say like for example, I think a better example isn't to say like let's say a crybaby. I think let's take someone who's being let's say I don't know like traumatized as a child and like like to eat vegetables or whatever is essentially like unbelievably traumatic for them. Like it causes them a great amount of suffering. Would I reasonably expect them people to engage within ethics as it stands, as a sentientist position? No, I don't. But then I would also say that that doesn't mean that we should allow them to commit harm against another agent. It's like I understand that, like for example, that someone who's absolutely insane, for example, may have the overwhelming urge, quote unquote, to harm another. But I'd say that their mental instability does not justify the action. It essentially just explains why they did it. It's like they didn't enter ethics because there was something broken in them that prevented them from being ethical. So they need treatment.
Right, but then I have to ask, why is it that people are okay? You're okay with the fact that people harm animals through luxuries, but not harming them through eating them directly?
In what respect? Like, what am I okay with?
Well, you said that if someone needs certain luxuries to maintain a positive phenomenological experience, that would be justified.
I mean, like
But
by positive, I mean like as in not negative to an unreasonable level. Like as in
sure,
like they would be as in something that they could not bear.
uh-huh, right. So if somebody needed the luxuries of modern society in order to achieve that state, they would be allowed to harm animals
I
in
never
order
said they'd
to
be
do that.
allowed. I never said that we should allow them. I said that if anything, we shouldn't allow them, as in we shouldn't, because we would see them as a negative force of nature. I would say that they've essentially lost their own agency. They're not able to make the rational decision because of their circumstance. This is what
So
Hegel calls
somebody who enjoys luxuries,
well, this is what Hegel calls tragedy, when an individual is incapable of engaging in ethics because of the system of drives is in conflict. The example he gives is a mother who's caught between stealing to feed her child and starvation. And she can disagree with the notion of stealing while still stealing to feed her child because our system of drives is in error. So what he would say is ethics would be the solution which allows her to enter the scenario. Like the state would need to reform itself so that her system of drives is no longer in conflict whilst the harm is diminished. And ethics allows for that.
I don't know if that so much answers the question that I had.
Sorry,
Be-
okay, well, from what I understand, if I reiterate the question was essentially what justifies an individual and allows an individual to commit harm so long as it's like the minimum for their positive or like not negative phenomenological experience, as in they would be psychologically distressed to a point in which they're incapable of ethics. The psychological fragility is not great. And part of that's eating meat. So if they don't eat meat, they become mentally unstable.
yeah,
Um,
versus somebody who also has a disposition, but it's towards luxuries. Like they want to play video games, they want to do other
yeah,
things within
I'd say
society,
that both.
but those also cause harms to animals. So where's the delineation between these two different things?
Well, I mean, the first guy I'd say is unstable, but what was the second example in terms of like so somebody has the same disposition as in they would be unstable if they didn't uh, take these luxuries.
Yeah, like play video games
Well, I
or
would I would agree. I would agree. I'd say that like they would also be unstable. Like someone who's a video game addict, for example, who lives in that basement and can't stop playing games all day. It's not the right thing for them to
I
do.
never gave them that extreme of a personality. I'm just
I,
saying
I
as
know,
a
I
person.
know, but I mean, like it's helpful for it to be that extreme because it just shows like their disposition, doesn't it? Like psychological, like for example, it can show how
No,
it
I
can.
think it only benefits your position to make it that extreme. I'm trying to talk about somebody who just lives a normal life, goes to work, comes back, plays some video games to relax for an hour. Now, we could say that electricity use is unjustified, right? That's a
Mhm.
possible way you could go because it harms animals,
Well, I
right?
mean,
This
you say
guy
it's
should just,
unjustified, but then you'd have to show why it was unjustified. So you'd have to show like that the electricity consumed created X amount of harm that was greater than the amount of phenomenological experience, subjectivity expressed by that individual. And
so
considering,
then what? Okay, hold on. Like you're giving me this deontic principle of why people can't eat meat is that well it causes harm to another being, so it's unjustified. But then when I give you this video game, it sounds like you're utilitarian now, and you're just adding it
yeah,
up. And
I can understand why it sounds like that because there's elements of consequentialism and deontology in a Hegelian position. So,
well,
in ter-
yeah, but it also the problem is you seem to be picking whichever one is most beneficial to your position.
No, like so. What I would say is that we are morally obligated. Like the whole time, I've asserted that we are morally obligated or ethically obligated to each other in terms of subjectivity, and the greatest expression of subjectivity is overall the greatest ethical outcome. However, individuals, as they express their subjectivity, are motivated by their drives. And if their drives are not respected to a certain level, then they'll be incapable of entering an ethical scenario. If they're incapable of entering the ethical scenario, then we cannot determine how subjectivity is being expressed to a greater overall degree. The consequence is that is being respected is the subjectivity and its greatest overall expression, and the deontic principle is to respect subjectivity. So I don't see the issue there.
Well, because the playing video games doesn't respect subjectivity, neither does the eating meat. But then we can also construct a scenario where somebody eats meat, needs to do so to respect his own subjectivity, otherwise they'll be upset. And we can also make an analogous situation where somebody doesn't play video games, then they'll be upset. But you seem to be okay with one scenario and you're not okay with the other, despite the
No,
fact that
no.
they seem symmetrical.
I think there is that. I think they're both ethical scenarios, and I think that they both relate to, like for example, the reason I can make a more definitive claim on the eating meat scenario is because of the extremity of eating meat. Eating meat causes the death of another subjective being, which means it annihilates a subjective being from existence. Which means
So
that,
so does playing video games.
in what respect is playing video games annihilate another
Pollution. Pollution
pollution?
can just pollution can kill animals.
Well, yeah, but like if we look at how much, like for example, let's say like what would you say, like how many kilowatt hours was produced to run an Xbox, like
Uh-huh.
and a TV, and then how much that contributes to the overall pollution generated by corporations,
Like, let's say you found out that
and
playing
then
an hour kills one insect.
that's not even including the um that's not even including the bloody economic aspect of how an individual is able to affect the energy production of that state. So, like, for example, you could argue very easily that an individual who does not buy meat has a much greater impact upon the overall total meat production than someone who turns off their Xbox
Yeah,
in
no, I'm
overall.
fine with saying that eating meat would be a greater impact than playing video games. But that's besides the point. Because
Is that
I
the
can
point?
just, yeah, it is besides the point unless we're going pure utilitarian, right?
No,
We're looking for this cutoff point.
you can have like for example, I would say that you can have an obligation which is greater or lesser than another obligation. Like for example, like
Yeah, but that's fine.
in a
But
deonic
you
format.
could give
So
up
like
either.
no, but like look at it like this, right? I can have an obligation to let's say not beat up someone in the street, and then I can also have an obligation to not call someone a name in the street. Most deontologists would argue that my obligation to not beat someone up in the street was greater than my obligation to not call them a name.
Right,
And
but you shouldn't do
In
either.
Hegel, it's even more clear because it's related to the overall phenomenological experience, the consequences. So my deontological principle would be violated in relation to the consequences I'm producing if I try and say that calling someone a name was worse than beating them up.
It just doesn't make sense because you would advocate that you don't do either.
I would advocate that yeah, you should do is the greatest good possible.
Uh-huh. So
It's practicable.
why wouldn't we just turn around and say, yeah, you shouldn't eat meat. You also shouldn't play video games.
I would say that you can have a moral obligation to a lesser degree to do something like not play video games if it would reduce damage to subjectivity. I agree to that.
Uh-huh. And
It
since
might
we
be
do know
eventually,
that pollution
like I
does in
said,
fact do that, then
I
shouldn't we
said,
be minimizing pollution?
I absolutely agree. We should be minimizing pollution, and if you want to do that, I would recommend going vegan.
Right. So then why isn't it that you suggest a Janus lifestyle?
Well, I mean, like one, my knowledge of Jainism is fairly limited, so in terms of whether I'm suggesting it or not, I wouldn't be entirely sure. From what I'm aware, Jainism is fairly minimalistic. Now, I would
Yeah.
actually advocate for minimalism in a roundabout way. I think that the cessation of desires into the point of which even for the individual is usually the greater format for them to live. that desire itself is a form of suffering. So the individual with less desires typically suffers less in a value relation, so long as like there are certain desires which are justifiable and others that are not. In terms of Jainism, from what I've seen, there seems to be a disregard of the individual's own subjectivity and their own capacity to live a happy life. It seems to be more stoic than ethical.
Or okay, but all right. So you would be fine with like Jainism plus a little bit more, right?
Yeah,
That
so
seems to
long as that
be
the individuals were capable of a positive experience. Yeah. And I mean, that is also dependent upon the development of psychology within the state, which I think is directly related to my argument, which is essentially that one can only understand themselves in relation to the other. And so, a good example is that individuals in our consumerist society are fairly bratty and spoilt, and so want more and more, and aren't happy with lower amounts of with lower amounts of luxuries, which tends to harm them phenomenologically, which means even though they typically act as though they want a product, the reality is if they give up their desire for the product and refuted it and vetoed it, they would probably psychologically develop to become happier in general because they wouldn't feel the desire as prominently within their lives.
yeah. Well, I'm not sure that people actually work like that, but I don't think that everybody can just give up what they previously had and then all of a sudden just become a different individual and
Oh, I don't
not.
think it's like flip a switch.
But let's move. Like, okay, so it seems to be that you would be about as, I'm not saying that they're the same obligation, eating meat and eating or playing video games, but you see your position seems to take that we should be against both extra technological uses if somebody could give them up and still achieve positive phenomenological experience.
Yeah, if you can get like a good if you can have a good life by like watching sunsets and spending time with your friends and family and living in a way that it reduces overall harm to others to the greatest degree. Yeah, yeah, do it. That's essentially the point of ethics.
Okay, and then let's move on to why we think this is an obligation.
Yeah, so essentially what I said before, like if we talk about an individual's actions in relation to desire, I'd say what desire is an action urging process within an individual directed at a specific end. That end is in relation to the experience of that individual. So I want to, let's say, drink um, that iron brew because iron brew ultimately brings me satisfaction. And
Hmm.
satisfaction is a positive experience that I'm trying to enjoy. When I speak of desire, I'm not speaking of simply a particular instance. I don't go, desire is my urge for iron brew, or desire is my, like I don't know, fear of I don't know, someone coming at me with an axe and my wanting to run away. Like desire actually is the universal which ties these together, and I would say that's how we metaphysically understand the world. That we actually don't understand particulars because what they are is infinite and infinite in their data, as in they are flat and transparent. There is no way to make a deductive um, argument or understanding of particular instances. I think a good example
I
is if I
I'm
was
going to tell you, I have no idea of the Hegelian language of things being infinite, flat, and transparent. I have no idea what any of that
okay, that's
means.
not Hegelian, that's just me being shit, right? But I'll explain it better. So, like, think of it like this: when you describe what Hegel calls the imminent or the immediate moment, like the present, if you are just to describe the present in its pure phenomenological state, what words we would be able to use would be like here, now, this, that, and they're like inherently extensive in relation to what's going on around us. But even the application of those words, if we were to say that they had any tie to an object of experience, then they must transcend that individual experience because when that experience changes, they would no longer be applicable. If we see that they are applicable, then what we are describing as a particular, in which case, if I go, this is that, and then the moment changes, I cannot hold that deduction um, true. Like there is no way to show that it was that, that it is, it continues to be that, that the entailment still holds, right? It's kind of like the Frege Geaching embedding problem. The point I would say is that when we try to understand objects within the world, what we do is actually destroy this experience and apply a linguistic construct upon it. In which case, we allows us to go like, this is a table, and that is a tree, that is a light, and what we are doing in this scenario is divesting, bless you, divesting individual metaphysical properties from one another. In each property holds not being another property. So a light is not a table is not a chair, etc. And the relation with these concepts creates what we would understand to be the material world, which is the first world, I would say, that we're able to understanding of the world, which allows us to make deductive propositions.
Right. I actually do understand what you're saying, but I think a lot of people are getting lost. So I might want to sum it up in simpler
Yeah,
language.
go for it, man.
Okay, so like if you're in the moment experience of something like a table, we wouldn't just call it a table because that table would mean just this object at just this moment, just this experience. But we don't just say that. What we say is a table, which is a concept we can use over time. We use the word table to mean what it is now and what it is later and what it was in the past in order to actually make arguments. And if we didn't do that, then we really couldn't say anything.
Exactly, exactly. And I would say, in order to do that, I'd say we need linguistic verification from the other, to be able to hold these divestations of reality constant, to know that this is a table, to know that that is a light, and so on. We need the engagement from another through psychological recognition, which allows us to understand both individuals as capable of normativity and verification and falsification. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to actually create like a language, essentially.
But yeah, okay. But the thing is, I only think we really need it to be able to create sort of actions and nouns. The actual phenomenological experience of positivity can just be a completely subjective process, such that I have a brain that recognizes a table being a linguistic construct of my community, but due to my own subjective experiences, I also have, whenever that linguistic word is triggered, a another chemical process which starts in my brain, which gives me a positive experience. It doesn't seem to be that we need a linguistic concept in order for emotions to be able to attach to these linguistic concepts. What we need is our own individual experiences. So I don't see how we remove subjectivity from this.
Well, oh, I'm not trying to defeat subjectivity. I mean, like in terms of one, we can argue about materialism and like the brain and so on be the causal factor of this. But in terms of psychology or like the psyche, we can understand an individual to have a positive experience within the world. Like I think animals, for example, have a positive experience within the world and don't have a have a linguistic structure. And I think it's usually held to a pretty basic nature which is inherent within them. Like like to hurt a dog is to essentially cause its neurons to fire and it feels a pain response and so on. Like I absolutely agree with you there. And they don't have language, so I'm not saying that that their relationship to objects is entirely defined by language. I'm saying that we cannot know it unless it is made definable, as in definite. And so what I would say is that in terms of what we are doing when we are in relation to with the other, is we are trying when we are seeking pleasure. We are not simply seeking pleasure, we are seeking the means to achieve pleasure. We are seeking pleasure, we also, when we act, we are acting in a way to obtain the most pleasure. And we cannot help but desire that which is most desirable, right? Like if we come to realize that actually there is something that would want more than what we are currently wanting, we inherently want that because we just want it more. It's more desirable. Um,
Right, but people are epistemically limited on this point, right? Like
um,
there
yeah,
could be a state of affairs that is explained to me as being the best, I might even be able to rationally acknowledge it as the best and still not able to do it because I have a certain brain pattern which seeks immediacy as pleasurable experiences and so
Uh,
always fire towards that regard.
well, I mean, like what I would say that would probably correspond to what I would call an addiction.
Yeah,
In
sure.
which,
You could call it an addiction, but either way, it exists.
yeah, in which case
The
I would
ontological
recommend
state
that
compares.
that it's unhealthy and you should seek treatment. Like that it would be unethical to allow
Yeah,
yourself
but
to
whether or not
maintain.
you seek treatment is going to be another dependency on whether or not your brain desires to seek that treatment.
Well, it's not like your brain. I don't think calling your brain separate from you is like a helpful sort
Well,
of
I
like.
think it helps in material to put it into material context in
But I
order
would
to
say that like
understand that there's because I mean I'm free against free will. You seem to be pro free will. So
I'm
for
pro
me,
free will. Yeah,
it's just useful for me to put it into materialistic terms because that's basically the terms that I understand how things work.
yeah, and I would say that the materialistic terms that you attribute as essence preceding existence in this case, like before, like when we talk about phenomena and our experience in the world, if we accept that there is some sort of causal notion before that existence, that we would be incapable of having knowledge on it. Essentially, you're trying to attribute what I would call something epistemologically prior to epistemics, in which case it's a non-entity. We cannot know it. I don't think you can prove determinism in any way. But free will, I think, is undeniable for the process of being able to even attribute an individual's choice or approval to various concepts from which these fields are dependent. So when an individual verifies or falsifies as something being true or false, they are expressing that they give acknowledgement, that they would agree or disagree, and I think that that implies a notion of free will, which the field of like causality in science, for example, in materialism, an
But what
individual being
implies the
driven
notion
by
of free
brain would be
will?
dependent.
What
Hmm?
implies it? What implies the notion of free will?
I would say that the epistemic engagement within individuals, just the
Why?
simply
Why
the
does that
engage.
need free will?
Well, I would say that because if what we are doing is to try and, I would say that what we are doing is trying to verify and falsify our own propositions. And I'd say that those propositions that we are trying to verify or falsify are in relation to our decision to accept or defy X.
Yeah, but why couldn't that be deterministic? Like, I don't see what there needs free will. Like, yeah, I
Well, I'm
thought you were
saying
making
that
an argument
it's
that
not
it necessitates free will.
like I'm not saying that it couldn't be like the point I'm trying to say is that we cannot attribute a notion of causality to it. That is the first experience. Like it's like saying like the fundamental experience of consciousness is this attribution of like approval or disapproval, and to try and talk about something prior to it is nonsense, whether it's like free will or like as in like I caused it myself, or the nature caused it. Both are nonsensical statements. And the problem isn't with free will, the problem is with the problem of free will.
Uh, I'm really trying to sort this out. Like, okay, you're talking about these
Starshine.
first
Starshine.
phenomenological you're talking about these first phenomenological experiences, but it seems that we induce a lack of free will through an introspection of multiple experiences
Well, I
and
mean, you
noticing.
may, but like not everyone induces a lack of free will, and then we can accept some causal nature. Like that's the hermeneutic account of free will in the Hegelian sense, is to accept that we might not choose the content of our desires, as in first order desires, but then we're capable of choosing our actions.
Yeah, but why would we attribute this ability? Like, what is the you that is deciding these things if it isn't just the qualities that make you up,
I'd say
which would which
you
would
you
lead to determinism?
well, I would say you is the concept of like the concept of identity I, and the concept I is a rational construct. So I'd say you are reason.
I am reason.
Yeah,
I don't know what that means.
it means
I
that
would think I
you
have
have the
to be
ability
something
to
that I would
like
say
it's
I am
possible.
desire.
Well, I'd say like, well, I mean,
Not only that, I'm not just some universal understanding of desire. I am a set of desires. I am a bunch of action urging processes that all execute and attempt to um, delineate between each other. Whichever one wins, wins.
you
And
see,
the only
I
thing that I
disagree.
am that notices that, and then we can construct concepts over top of that. But that has nothing to do with the basis of why I'm doing any of the things that I do.
Well, I mean, like when I say like you or reason, like I mean like as in like you are a combination. Like like I'm not arguing like for example like a platonic tripartite soul where you are purely reason separate from the passions, right? Like that's fucking nonsense. Like what I'm saying is that like what is attributable to you is the agent who operates in the world behavioristically, which includes, for example, notions of decisions, decision making, and the passions. We can accept that the passions, for example, seem to occur to us, like as in I feel something, but like to allow that to entirely dictate action seems to not include our own action delineating process in which we go, this is better or worse than X. And that process is essentially the process of reason. So when I say like you are reason, I mean like you cannot divorce reason from what you are.
Yeah, but I don't think we actually need to use reason in order to do actions. I think it's just a process, one of the processes that we do use sometimes, which is able to abstract and consider future possibilities in order to make actions. But that doesn't also make that any more free will than any other process that I could possibly do. Now I could just smack a mosquito on my shoulder without really thinking about it just because of the pain that I feel. It's like a reflex, but I don't see how that's any less or more deterministic than any other thinking process that goes on in my brain that uses abstraction.
Well, I mean, like one, as I said, like I don't think that you can give a materialistic cause for your thinking process and it be epistemologically valid. Um, so like we can disagree
Well,
there.
I don't think, well, I mean, going to the, even if I say, look, I don't think I can deductively prove this because I don't, I don't see how your position is anything other, your position can say anything other than exactly what is occurring, right? If you're going to go idealistic about it, you can just
Mhm.
say, I did this thing, then I did that thing, then I did this thing.
What
This
I would
isn't
say,
a notion of free will. This is just stuff happening.
well, what I would say is that I mean, stuff happening is the basis of phenomenological experience. Um, but like it's stuff happening in the sense that it's from a first-person scenario, first-person position, which we attribute to it. Like I is a first-person concept. It is like I look through my eyes. And this is what I would call I as subjectivity in the sense like it is the combination of reason, the passions, the various total combination of what we call the agent.
Well,
Um, and
a
that's the
combination
first
of things
principle. I
called the
would say that's
experience,
the
right?
I'd say
Like the
that's
experience
the
is
basis.
happening here. I
I'd say
think.
that subjectivity is the basis of how we even enter epistemics. Like without that subjectivity being the case, it simply is. Without it being the case, we wouldn't enter an epistemological relationship, which is essentially the use of reason to determine whether or not something is correct or not. And I would argue that in this subjective framework, like the subjective experience rather, we are obviously we feel as though, and I think no one denies this, even the people who are deterministic say that, the illusion of free will. We feel as though we are making conscious decisions about objects and of our desires. We feel as though we are choosing A or not A. Like, and I think that's like, and
No,
we
I
feel,
agree. We have those sensations. I just don't know why we would ever call them free will. If I choose
well,
A,
this is the thing. Like the problem is that when we talk about free will and when we're trying to attribute causation or talk about any causal or non-causal relationship beyond this experience, we are in error. It's erroneous. The problem is the problem of free will.
uh, it's like I don't need to talk about causation in order to dispute free will. I don't have to say that it was caused, therefore no free will. I can
Okay,
just say I
how would you
chose
dispute free will?
and I couldn't have done otherwise.
Well, you say that why would you have a notion of couldn't if there's no such thing as causation involved? Like,
Because all I can notice is that in my experience, I chose A over B and I can't go back. So that's it. I
not like
chose.
what you're saying is like I can't do otherwise. It's not that you couldn't have. It's not that you didn't make the choice, because you can't argue that you didn't make.
Okay, so I can't do otherwise rather than couldn't. But then how do we get to free will? Because free will would imply that I could have.
Well, that's the thing. It could have, like, I mean, but like what I was trying to point out is the temporal aspect of that. If it's in hindsight, like you can't do anything in hindsight. Like, as in, I'm not. I think everyone, even who agrees with free will, it says you can't will backwards. So you can't will back in time. Um,
Yeah.
but
But
I think if I understand you correctly, what you mean is that at the moment of decision, you have you are unable to choose between A or B.
no, that's you're going to choose one of them.
No,
Yeah,
but
I mean,
right.
so you do make a choice, but the free will notion is that if you went back, you would have been able to choose the A or B again.
Right. Well, no, I think this is the thing. Like, I'd say that like what we have to do now is like if we accept the non-deterministic, indeterminate free will of Sartre, which is like literally just fucking spontaneous bullshit that appears in the phenomenological experience. You know, you know what I mean. I would agree with you there. That's not like something you determine. It's ironically unfree because of how uncaused it is. Like it's so uncaused, it's a nothingness, which is why it's like being a nothingness. Um, the point is that when we act in the world, we attribute um, notions of identity. We attribute notions of self and like subjectivity, first person processes. And what we do is we say that okay, there is desire that is running through us that we cannot be denied, and that desire has X telos based on our nature. That telos will have to kind of understand as an ethical endeavor, like what is the good of humanity, what is the good of like me. In which case, I'd say that like our egos, our understanding of the world as we interact with each other, is essentially built up on a relationship. I'd say that's when the point of choice comes in, when we're able to make second order desires. If we were purely animalistic and that like nothingness, we don't make choices. We can have good and bad experiences, but we don't make choices. The point of choice comes in is whether there is a differentiation, a competition between two desires, which is resolved through the act of reason. That is the notion of choice and free will, self determination. But
Right. No, I think that is the notion of choice. I don't think that's the notion of free will. There's nothing free about it.
well, I
Free
would say
seems to
that
be like something else.
it, well, it's the no. This is why continentals say that the problem of free will is the problem of free will. It's not because we can't attribute a causation to it. The causation is essentially like self-directed. It is what we attribute this notion of I as. The mechanism itself resolves the issue and then continues forward, and it resolves the issue with use of logic, with reason.
With the use of logic?
Yeah,
No, I
well,
don't. No, you can't use pure logic to make a decision.
no, it's logic in relation to the system of drives.
Yeah, in relation to a system of drive, sure. But there's nothing free about that. Like, I don't know
Well,
why we're
there's no
calling it free will.
like the freedom of it
It's just a
is
choice. It's
well,
just using reason to make a choice. It's not free.
well, I would say that using reason to make a choice is like it depends. Like this is the this when I say like it depends on what you mean by free. If you mean entirely uncaused, there is no such thing as like that's not free will anyway.
No,
That's like
yeah, well, I'm not even bringing up causes. But what do you think it's free from?
well, I would say free. I would argue free will, as I would define it, would be self determination. I'd say self determination is the combination of what is being uncaused in the sense that it is an action which is fundamentally like reason is not caused by anything. Reason is like fundamentally part of this phenomenological experience. And then I would say, and so is the system of drives. And then I would say that the other notion it must combine with is this notion of being unrestricted, which is to combine this action urging process with the desired end,
But
which is to
you would
say,
agree you don't choose your system of drives.
yeah, I agree. We don't choose our system of drives. We can choose
So
between our system of drives. We can choose between the various desires that, like,
yeah, and what decides between a system of drives if it's not another drive?
reason.
Well, and what do you mean reason? Because reason would go
Reason can
whatever
differentiate.
one is the bigger drive, right?
So reason can differentiate um, the value, can make us aware of the various value relations those drives have to each other. So we, as I said, like the
Sure,
drives
but
themselves,
what is it trying to get to is other than the biggest expression of them.
it is trying to get to the biggest expression of them. I would say absolutely the case, and that is in direct relation to how the world is. The expression of the drives holds, like, what unites the drives is the experience of the outcome of those drives. I don't simply eat cake to eat cake. I eat cake to experience the pleasure of eating cake. However, if I come to know that eating cake will cause an allergic reaction
Right.
and
So
I've rationally deduced that,
I
I
just
can
want to
then
make sure
choose
you
to
agree with me here.
no,
Is
I have
that
no. I think that we'll both agree on that. From what I'm gathering.
I think to some point we are aggressively agreeing with each
Yeah.
other. but, but the idea here is that you have a system of drives that you don't choose, and then what reason does is choose whichever one of those is the strongest by trying to abstract things about the world.
Yeah, essentially,
So,
it creates
but then,
universals which
but
allow us to
again,
create categorical imperatives.
the way the
One must be
reasoning
better than the
goes,
other.
the reason still moves towards that thing of the greatest drives, which you didn't choose.
Like what we do is, well, that's the thing. Like what we do is differentiate the greatest expression of our subjectivity. The action itself is the expression. We don't choose what is the greatest expression that's given to us.
Right. But you just mean chose is like just that process that occurred.
Well, what I mean by chose is like an action of self-determination, like delineated by reason.
This just sounds like a fancy way of saying that some analysis happened,
Well,
and
I
then you,
mean, like it depends because like I'm unsure because it seems like what yeah, like analysis happened, yeah, like some analysis happened, and then in relation to like what we would say is the fundamental like building blocks of what you are, which is like your desires, and so what you have is a process of analysis, and what you have is a process. Well, sorry, I'll say that in a different way. We are making a fundamental mistake and say what you have. What we should be saying is what who you are is a fundamental process of analysis combined with a system of drives.
and you don't, and there's no you prior to the start of analysis that uses analysis to say you need to start using analysis. Analysis just happens,
Yeah,
right? So this is why I hate calling things like this free will.
this is free will, man. This is definitely
This is
this,
just stuff happening.
this is why, like in continental philosophy, like there's a differentiation between free will, capital H, space will, and then free will, like lowercase, and then like merged together.
Yeah, and the nothings, and we all get pissed off. And
No, we don't need to bring in Heidegger. I'm not defending that.
anyways, well, how are we getting obligation out of this
So what I
entire
would say an
conversation that we talked
obligation,
about?
what I would say an obligation is the awareness that one drive should be accepted over another. That to accept one drive over another when we um, if we can know otherwise, would be the mistake. So, for example, if an individual chooses to, for example, eat cake, even though they know they're going to be allergic to cake, um, they've allowed a lesser desire to be the primary function of action, like the primary function of action. When I would say what they need to do, the action of free will, self determination, would be to always choose the rational choice between one's desires. That would be where our obligations lie. Ethics is in relation to the greatest overall outcome of our behaviors,
Uh-huh.
mediate our behaviors in the best way.
Well, okay. So you seem to think it's possible that we could do otherwise. Like we could choose the allergic cake.
Um, we choose to what? Sorry, did you say choose to be allergic to cake there, or did I mishear
No,
that?
no, we can choose the cake that we're allergic to. We can just go, that tastes good. Oh God, why did I do that?
Yeah.
It seems to be a one of the possible things that people do. So what do you mean by people must do otherwise if whatever processes that they use, if that analysis occurs and those drives occur and it chooses them to
Well,
make itself sick? What do you mean
well,
by they should have done? They should
Well,
choose
when
the
I say they should have done otherwise, I would say that their reason has not been properly applied.
reason has okay. So this is sounds like a very Aristotelian point. Is that if you really had the reason, you wouldn't have done that.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
I don't know how to falsify such a statement
Because it's right.
because we don't have against.
I'm joking, but sorry, what is it?
I'm saying we don't actually have an example of a man of pure reason who knows everything, and therefore we can see if Aristotle was correct or not.
True, true. But what we can do is differentiate more or less rational agents and show whether they do, whether it is indicative of a good life. I can see that, for
Yeah, that
example.
would be circular. If we every time we took somebody and we said we chose that person chose the thing that made them more happy, therefore they were the most rational.
True, I think there is an aspect of that, but what we could do is then, maybe instead monitor the reasoning, the rational capabilities of an agent based upon like other things that they are reasoning. So, for example, purely a priori, non-relation to the individual desires, and then test that whether they maybe live better lives.
Right. Well, we would be judging their rationality by our rationality. I'm not sure that really escapes the
Well, I
problem.
think that we've got to judge it against an objective standard, haven't we? Which is like, did they come to the correct results based upon their application of logic?
It goes right back to the circular problem.
Well, no, because logic's not the circular problem. Logic is necessary.
No, it's an objective system. How am I supposed to know? How are you supposed to know?
Like it's not that it's like when we talk about something being like, for example, true, we can talk about it being true as in that it is sufficiently true, or we can talk about it being necessarily true. And I think Wittgenstein shows that we cannot reject logic in language. And I think Aristotle even shows that any argument that we try to use is going to use the fundamental principles of logic. And so what we end up having to accept is this phenomenological experience which we are in is a logical one. It's not something that we can remove logic from. It is a fundamental nature of being.
All right. So if somebody makes a purely logical analysis and then chooses the cake anyways, would that falsify your position?
If someone made a purely logical analysis and then chose cake anyway, like if they were like, I am aware to the fullest extent that I ought to be doing X, and that by
Well, no,
doing,
it's not ought. I think ought begs the question. I think
all
they
right,
should
okay,
say that the cake would give eating the cake is going to make me miserable. I'm going to wish that I didn't eat that cake, but God, I'm going to eat this cake.
I mean, I wouldn't say that it would falsify the point. I would say that they can be overcome with their passions, so that you can have an individual who, I wouldn't say it wasn't them choosing, is what I would
It
say.
wasn't them choosing.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't even know what that means now.
So like, so I would say that like for example, if they would only apply like reason, then it would be what like it would.
No, you can't apply only reason. We to explain this. Reason is
Yeah,
always in relation to
well,
the
I
drive.
agree. You can overvalue reason, as in like a perverse philosophy, in the words of Vico, in which you don't respect your own system of drives, and you instead try to seek a
No,
universal.
there's not you that respects your drives. It is just your drives.
Yeah, okay, I see what you say, but what I'm saying is that I mean, do we agree that like there is the differentiation of the drives with reason? What I'm saying is that like the attribution of a universal concept without like particular application commits an error within a hermeneutic environment. So if I say like without consideration of the scenario, if I misapply a concept through my use of reasoning, then I've made a mistake. And if I value that reasoning beyond, like, for example, the like other desires that are inherent within me, my mistake was in my reasoning in terms of like the language of my culture, like what conceptual schemata, that kind of shit, right? But that's overall affected me, so I'm not making a free choice. As in, it's not necessarily the best choice for me, an expression of my overall tell us,
Is
right?
it is a free choice have something to do with the best choice?
Yes,
Ah, you just completely. So whenever you make the best overall
the
choice,
best choice is the most free choice.
which really you're going to describe as eudaimonia, right? Like the best choice over time.
Yeah,
Because I think we can agree that eating the cake might be the best choice for about 5 seconds,
yeah, exactly.
right? So there is an actual, a time slice that you're choosing.
Yeah, and instead you would instead have to value the value responses from your entire system of drives, which is a universal concept, which is
But I,
uh,
I think
not
somebody
entirely
could just
central.
have certain drives that prioritize those immediate next 10 seconds,
Um, well,
right?
I think that
That's
they
just
could,
that
but
just happens to be what the drives that they were given are.
well, I could, but then they could, but then I would say that then that it's not an act of like freedom in that respect. It's not this like as in like for example, it's like when
Of course it's
Nietzsche.
their subjective. Where else do those drives come from? It's
Well,
not somebody else implanting them.
well, that's what I was about to bring up Nietzsche actually. I was about to bring up Nietzsche and the idea that essentially other individuals can influence you in such a way that differentiates your drives for you by modifying your reasoning, giving you false concepts which don't obtain, so that you.
No, no,
uh,
I'm not talking about concepts at all. I'm saying somebody can have all the correct concepts, all the correct logic, and just have a system of drives that prioritizes the
Oh, I see. I
immediacy.
disagree. I disagree. I would say that the system of drives doesn't differentiate itself. I would say that it's differentiated. Like the drives don't differentiate from each other from their strength. They're differentiated from their reasoning. It kind of attributes to them their strength. So the strength of a drive is dependent upon its ability to obtain the good it is trying to bring about.
Well, I see no reason to think that drives can't just be prioritized as as the way that they're given to you, rather than it's your reason which tells you which ones to prioritize. Your reason can explicate what's going to happen when you do certain actions, but I
But
think it's
which
still your
then
drive
modifies,
that it's
which
going to
then
decide which one of those two scenarios it prefers.
But even then, you can accept that like the awareness of the scenario change is modifies the drives in such a way that one's reasoning can differentiate, that can modify the power of the drive, the system
I
of drive.
think reason can only explain the choices. I don't
Nah,
think reason can make the choices.
look at it like this. Like if before I thought I was going to enjoy the cake, if I find out that there is something I'm going to be allergic to, it can alter my drives without anything happening to my drives and simply something happening to my awareness.
Yeah, it makes another choice available. It says, look, you're going to have to choose between these two things. But it's not the reason that makes the choice. It's still the drives. The
No,
reason
because
shows to you what's going to happen. It says, look, you have these sorts of scenarios. You're going to be sick for this long and you're going to have this much enjoyment. And to say that somebody has perfect reason is to say that they have perfect concepts of what's going to occur. But I
yeah,
still think
exactly.
it's the drives that's going to end up picking which one. And I think somebody could have the drive that picks the immediacy. That's their nature.
See, I disagree. I think that if when we understand desire, I would say that if they were to always choose immediacy in the terms of their scenario, then the drive would. I mean, you could say that they could be like inherently built to
Well, they don't
suffer.
have to always pick it.
I'd say like, but then I would say that the individual who is, for example, like this is what I would say addiction is like the individual who chooses a drive of a greater degree despite the awareness of the overall outcome is falsely applying concepts, or they're being caused by some sort of damaged process. When we call damage, we say it's unhealthy, it's incapable of actually achieving its overall ends. Like
But that's
fuck
just
man,
a
you're
description
short,
of
you're
what's
short
occurring.
wiring, like
That doesn't falsify me. You could say, well, they're stuck being an addict. And I'd be like, yeah, that's my point.
I'd say that their being an addict is an expression of their like unfreedom.
Of their unfreedom, which seems to be just a concept you're begging. It's just this, you're saying that if they were reasonable, they would have done this. They didn't do this, therefore they're not reasonable.
How is
Which
it a
shows
concept I'm
which
begging? What I'm saying is that
how am I
they
supposed to
what
give a
they
counterexample to that?
Well, what I'm saying is that they are asserting that they want to bring around world X, yet constantly attempt to bring around world Y. Therefore, they are not free because their attempts to subjectively expound their will upon the world is a contradiction in which it destroys itself. So the
No,
will is
I don't. I think the problem is they have poor self-description.
I absolutely disagree. I mean, like, don't get me wrong. We could agree that that self description and understanding the self ultimately, opens up a plethora of opportunities for them to understand otherwise. But you can come to the conclusion that their understanding of self, not only their understanding of themselves flawed, but their themselves are flawed in the sense that they are making the choices which will always bring them suffering. That they are actually not capable of being free because there is something damaged within them. Like they are being caused by something else. That is not simply, that is not the correct combination of their reasoning applied to the world and their system of drives. That either one is broken, either they're in like a state of psychosis and psychological addiction, or they have a physical addiction, which their reasoning cannot.
Oh,
Um,
now who brings in psychology and physicalism? I see how it is.
now,
It's fine for you to invoke these
what
concepts,
I'm
but when
saying
I
is,
do it, it's nonsense. Yeah, I
well,
see.
what I'm saying is that it doesn't defy the notion of free will because it's hermeneutic. We can accept causal notions and have free will. But
Yeah,
what you are
except I'm
saying is
not
that
allowed
it's
to bring up
deterministic.
causal notions. That's the
You
problem I
said it
have.
was deterministic.
I don't think it needs to be deterministic, but it could be. I don't think it matters. If you're willing to invoke materialism to start giving explanations to why
Well, I think
somebody's
that
being unreasonable, then I think I can use materialism to talk about why we are causally determined. I don't think you get access to this domain and I don't.
no, what I'm not saying that you can't bring up, like, for example, notions of addiction and so on. But if you're trying to say that someone is always determined because of like pre-caused like behaviors like that your brain produces, I would say like no, like that's not the case. Like the addict, for example. I mean, like if we were to say like someone at birth is like always hyper addicted to something and they can never be free from it, then yeah, like maybe like we can say that like their reasoning could be aware of their own fucking like plight. Like yeah, okay, like I can accept that. But then if we were to say that humans themselves are always in this state, I see no evidence for that.
I
I
never
don't
said
think.
humans are all, but we're talking about contingencies. Somebody could be in such a state, and I'm
Yeah,
saying they could
I agree
apply
with
pure
addiction.
reason and be stuck there.
We both agree that there can be addicts.
Okay. So then, oh, well, we haven't even like touched on why anybody's obligated to be a vegan.
Right. If right, we'll try and bring it quickly back. So my point is that given that the individual who properly applies concepts of reason and those concepts that are rational are actually universals, which have been produced within a linguistic environment, then we have to accept that universal notions of value and its expression of value is what we are actually seeking to achieve, as in
No,
the
oh no, I don't. Get, show me
I
that
would say
inference.
I
Just
would
because
say
we're
that
applying universal concepts, why do we have to apply universal value?
I would say that universal it's universal notions of behavior which will actually allow us to obtain good results, positive phenomenological experience, which we cannot help but seek. So it's like, for example, that like I can accept that I should, for example, want to be in good health because I know that being in good health is overall the greatest possible probability that I will live a happier life because a life that is unhealthy typically invokes more suffering, and suffering I want to avoid by nature. I would say that that, for example, would be an ethical proposition, which is which I've been able to obtain because of like our unity within language, and without that, I
Well,
wouldn't be.
first off, I don't know if there can't be a person who's just happy being miserable. Like it's almost part of their identity, and if they weren't miserable and unhealthy, then they wouldn't know who they are. I certainly think that's a possibility. But what I want you to get to is why I have to value everybody else's values just because I value universal concepts like tables and ice cream and anything else.
Well, I would say that your ability to understand yourself is inherently dependent upon their understanding of you, psychological recognition.
Well, that just builds concepts.
Yeah,
What does
but
that have to do with me
those
valuing?
concepts, like your understanding of your own ego and your understanding of your own value, is not individualistic. You can't assert what that value will actually be. It has to be agreed upon between more than one agent.
No, like my subjective taste for chocolate ice cream doesn't need to be agreed on by anyone. I just put it in my mouth and I enjoy it.
Yeah, but
The
whether
fact that I call it ice cream and I discuss it as ice cream, and to apply reason, I have to use the concept ice cream, which is, invoked in a linguistic community. The fact that I enjoy it is just found out when I put it in my mouth.
when you look at it like this, I'm not saying that your simple enjoyment of it is what you use reason to determine. Like, I mean, you do in the sense that you have to use concepts, but like your actual choice to seek
Well, no,
that.
no,
Like,
no. I don't use reason to decide that I like it. I just use reason to describe with the thing that I like. Otherwise, I would just have an animalistic desire of
yeah,
ice cream.
yeah. So like essentially, you apply concepts which then divest that you like various notions of that
But that's
phenomenological.
nothing but a description. So why is it I
Yeah,
need to
that's purely
value
descriptive.
values? Like, what
But
gets me there?
I would say that like essentially your decision and act in the world is the point in which we have prescription, where like as in we have the opportunity to act in one way or another, and that's based around our understanding of a system of drives, which is our conceptualization of ourselves in relation to the world that we're going to bring around.
Yeah, but where does that get us to valuing values or just phenomenological experiences in general? And I mean,
Because
we haven't even touched on the fact that I don't think veganism necessarily does that. But
yeah, so essentially what I'm saying is that your ability to differentiate between your system of drives is dependent upon the system of drives of another agent and their commonality of being able to not only share normative framework, as in like we can validate and falsify, like validate and like verify each other's statements and shit,
yeah, but how do we
but
use normative frameworks to determine that when I put
but,
chocolate ice
but
cream in my
also
mouth, I taste
but
good. When they put
also
vanilla chocolate or
yeah.
vanilla ice cream in their mouth, they enjoy it. I don't need a normative framework to just notice that we're different people.
Yeah, we can be different, and that's fine. Like, and I'll get onto that in a second. Like, for example, like what I'm saying is not that you have to like chocolate ice cream, or that you otherwise you are wrong, but that in relation to how you are trying to behave in the world to bring around what we would call the good experience, the good life for you, you are reliant upon what we would differentiate as like positive or negative actions and behaviors, which are only verifiable in relation to each other. As in, I'm only able to say that's a good action if you verify or falsify it's a good action. So we are constantly in a language game which is evaluating our behaviors with each other in our likelihood to bring around the most positive scenario.
Yeah,
And
okay, but let's go to this basic example. It's like two people. One person hates chocolate ice cream, the other one likes it. In which way do they need to verify each other?
well, like for example, like they apply concepts to differentiate their desires. They understand that one person likes it, one person doesn't. What I would say is that then the ethical scenario in that sense would be the person who likes it to eat the ice cream, but then to come to that conclusion would have to have concepts which related to action in relation to how it's going to bring around value. As in, I don't like the chocolate ice cream, but I want it anyway. Why? Because I want you not to have it. Why do I want you not to have it? Because it expresses my domination over you. It's essentially like you can have a multiplicity of desires in relation to the other and verify which one is right or wrong in the sense like who gets what, how do we behave. Each one of these scenarios is dependent upon each other's verification.
What was where was the verification in this scenario?
Like so, for example, if you say you want like I want to have it, because I like chocolate ice cream, like the most basic like fundamental like desire about the ice cream, and then
Uh-huh.
there's like I want to have it. I don't want you to have it because I don't want you to have it. I don't like you, right? What I
Yeah.
would say is that in relation to respect, understanding subjectivity, understanding ourselves, comes this first implicit notion that everyone is equally capable of valuing themselves, of
Uh-huh.
valuing reality, of giving normative inferences of equal weight. And in which case, if I
Why are
say,
we giving them equal weight? Where did that come
because if we don't give them equal weight, then I would say that we're making a epistemological error.
from? What?
Like, like
Why?
so, for example, like you'd have to be because you'd be asserting it. you'd be saying that I am right. Why? Because I am right. Like that's
Sure,
why.
but
But
somebody
then
could truly feel that way.
it doesn't matter if they feel that way. That's the point. It's irrational, isn't it?
Yeah, how is it irrational? It's just say I'm going to prioritize my own desires. How is that a lack of reason?
No, it's like prioritizing your own desires is besides the point because to understand their own desires in relation to their actions, they've already had to accept that the other individual is capable of um, understanding their desires equally as capable as they're
No,
understanding.
I can agree. Somebody can also have desires, and they like their desires as much as I like my desires. Why do I have to care?
And when we talk about desire and we apply these universals and we use them in inferences, we are using universals which apply to both agents. And so if we only use it in application of one agent, we've used the universal incorrectly.
What's the universal that I'm supposed to be using? When I
So
talk
for
about my value, why am I
example,
applying
when you say
value?
my desire, you've made the mistake. Like it is desire. Like that's what we're talking about.
I
Like
don't think that's a mistake. I think that's just reality.
no, I think that individualism is not like a product of anything other than collective consciousness, which then delineates itself among individuals. I'm able to say me because we. If I didn't accept we, then I could not say me. If I reject we in any scenario, I've made a mistake.
Yeah, well, I have a concept of both we and me, and I can value the me concept more than the we concept. I don't see where this comes into contradiction.
Because if you value the me concept more than the initial one, then you're already presupposing an unfair epistemic relationship with the other. You're saying that what
It's
we
not
value.
an no, it's
What,
not an unfair epistemic
no, let me
relationship. It's
explain
an
what an
unfair
epistemic.
value relationship,
No,
but it's just one that
I
I could
think,
happen to have.
but, but then that unfair value relationship, I would argue, is irrational. If you're saying that it's irrational, then I would say then you're not the one describe. Then you're not
I wouldn't say it's irrational, it's irrational. It has
No,
nothing to
I
do
would,
with
I
rationality.
would absolutely disagree. I would say that your understanding of how you're going to behave cannot be irrational because then you wouldn't be the one. Like I
No, but
don't
this
believe.
isn't understanding. This is just which drive is stronger.
Well, no, I disagree. I mean, we've been through that one.
I see no reason why anybody would have to apply a universal concept of value in order to say, I could just kill someone and take their ice cream if I was some sort of psychopath who didn't care about other people, right?
Yeah, but
I wouldn't say I'm in contradiction with anything.
I'd say that
All
like
I'm doing is going off of this egoistic drive. That's not a contradiction.
what I would say is that when you actually like if we say that the drive is irrational, then I would say that there is no choice being made. Like it's like an addict or someone who's like or an animal like a
Well,
brute.
that was my point to begin with. Reason only shows you your option. It doesn't tell you which drives is going to pick which
See,
option.
I disagree. I would say that reason and your drives are the only available for free choice. Whilst if you are acting in a way that is deterministic and caused, or in a way to gain like some primitive desire, I'd say that's not you acting. Which is why like people like Plato would say, or Socrates would say, like, is the fool free? No, fool is not free.
Well, I think, well, of course, I don't think the fool's free because I don't think anybody's free. So that doesn't really show me anything. But yeah, so we have this fundamental difference on what reason is and what it does. For me, reason is just an explicating process. It gives you the information of the things that your drives could apply to. Your drives then just choose themselves because you don't choose your drives. You are your drives. So you
Well,
just end
it's
up picking whatever it is. I think reason is useful to explain your options. I just don't see in any way that if you choose a certain option, you didn't apply reason by definition. I think
I think
that's
we're
an
making.
unfair description of
I think
reason.
No, I think you're making a mistake in saying that that is a choice. I think that if the drives chose themselves, then there would only ever be one drive, and that would be the strongest. For there to be multiple drives and there to be a delineation between them implies a standard that is objective from both drives, which delineates the values.
No, I
That
don't think it's a standard. It just happens that some are stronger than the other.
Well, I would disagree. I would say that the ability for like the value of those drives can be differentiated and modified by an external process within the mind that actually analyzes and reevaluates each scenario.
Oh, but that doesn't change the drives. It just chooses what the drives could attach to. And I do
No,
think drives change, but it's only in relation to the drives themselves. I think we just
no, I
have
think we would
processes of
agree.
the brains that decide. It's just the same as like conditioning, where you
No,
just
no,
keep.
I think that we agree on one thing. Like you're saying that it doesn't change the drives. I would say yes, it does. I think I've just demonstrated it does. What it doesn't change is desire,
How
the
did you
drive.
just demonstrate that? I don't. I just see no demonstration of this.
Well, okay, I can try again if you'd like.
How are you demonstrating that the drives change due to reason?
Well, I
Right.
would say that
My
that one
explanation,
of
my
drive is
explanation is that somebody could just like I just wanted to say what you're disagreeing with is that somebody says, I want to eat cake, right? They see the cake, they want to eat it. That's only so much information. Another set of information is that the cake is poisonous. So now they have two things. They can decide between the taste of the cake and the poisonous consequences. So they have two things to think about. Then they can think about their Aunt Susan, who wanted to eat the cake, but now you'll be depriving her of that, and you like your Aunt Susan, so now that's another thing you can delineate
Mhm.
against. So as far as I'm concerned, reason picks out more things to think about and to apply your desires to. I don't see how reason tells you what your desires are supposed to be doing.
Well, I think what it does is it shows that there is a unity within your desires in relation to the overall life you lead.
I don't know what that means.
So, like, one drive might be to eat the cake, while the other drive might be to respect your Aunt Nellie who likes cake, right? They're two separate drives. Overall, what you're trying to do is create a world which is better than another world, as in you express your will upon the world, which is the greatest overall expression of value. Now, when you understand that expression of value to be across your entire life, reason would be the proper expression of concepts which accurately depicts how your life will be and the expression of those concepts across the entirety of your existence. Reason's not the drives, because if it was the drives, then it would be innate and it would just happen. If reason is separate from the drives, then it is modifying the relationship of drives to action, in which case, a notion of choice. It's separate.
But then I also put the notion that you could choose the immediacy over, this eudaimonia concept, and you just said no, that's an improper use of reason. But that just seems to beg the question of
Well,
what reason.
I think that we could say that like an individual can understand like apply concepts. I think this is the whole point of anguish, isn't it? That like Sartre talks about. One can understand themselves to be free, but be in bad faith. Like I can know that I could have chose otherwise, yet chosen something else. Like the whole point of what he's getting at is that what we can do in this scenario is we can tell ourselves lies and we can misdescribe ourselves in order to create an environment in which we do something which we know will harm us, but we've been psychologically incapable of acting otherwise.
I
So,
think the more reasonable explanation is that people choose the anguishing concept over and over and over again until they just get fed up and conditioned into trying the other type of drive.
well, no, absolutely disagree, because you can see people who will continue do it, not condition, and then die unhappy, whilst you can see people who
Yeah.
will do it will never do it in the first place, because or they'll do it until they talk to someone who's able, like a therapist, who's able to help them understand themselves better, understand the world better, and then that allows them to clear up their behaviors. They understand that, for example, the reason that they
No,
are
I don't think it's people helping them understand things better. I think the
oh,
best
absolutely.
the best form of psychological is the behavioral therapy where you apply certain actions to certain positive results, or you try to use extinction, which is the application of something you think is negative without a negative consequence in order to slowly modify someone's desires. It's through the action and the result that people's drives change. It's not through talking. The whole Freudian cognitive approach has been like the least successful.
One, I'd say that the Freudian approach is least successful because Freud thinks it's a science. I think that psychoanalysis is inherently successful in terms of not just simply modifying someone's behavior, but modifying their ability to actually understand why they are behaving in a certain way. I would also say that the ability to condition someone and modify their drives, it's like, yeah, I can train a dog and I can modify their drives. That doesn't mean I've actually allowed someone to express a more rational desire. I've just allowed them. I've went, all right, look, you're a bit broken. I'm going to fix you a little by, you know, changing your physical state. Like, both are effective in their own way at different things.
Well, I think it's effective because that's generally just how people change. Now, you can use reason in a sort of way to show people additional options. You could even like lie
I
to
think,
someone and say, you know, if you do this, then these results will come and they'll all be positive, and then you can end up convincing someone. And you could just talk less about the negative aspects and end up convincing someone. Like,
yeah, you can use rhetoric. You mean you can use rhetoric?
yeah, you can use rhetoric. So yeah, reason, like I said, explicates the options, and if you limit the options to manipulate them in such a way that it makes the option seem better than it actually was,
I
then
completely
people will
agree. And then
change.
I would call that a master slave dynamic, as in, like, an individual is using language to assert their own will upon the scenario. However, their assertion of their will is unjustified because they are acting as if it is pre justified in relation to the other. My desires matter more than your desires. My decision matters more than your decision.
I don't think
Even though,
that's
even though
unreasonable.
the
I think
first,
somebody's
even though
drives
the,
could be like that. I think the fact that we care about other people is just an evolutionary tool. It,
no,
it's
I
not
think that
it's
people.
not a pure reason. It just happens to be the case that we care about other people.
See, I disagree. I would say that the way that we, even if we ought to care about ourselves in the greatest overall expression, that we must care about each other. That what I am is not individualistic, it's actually a collective consciousness, understanding of an individual. That I wouldn't be anyone else. Like, I could not exist, for example, as I am 200 years from now with the application of different concepts. What I am is that application to this physical form in this environment.
Well, it's not that I disagree. Like if I was given a whole bunch of different concepts, yes, I would be in some sense a different person, and in some sense the same person because I'm still the same location of experience. But um, the point is like those base drives that I have that are able to attach to concepts and grow that the way they are is just an individual subjective experience unto myself. It's not a linguistic quality that people tell me what I'm going to care about. Like people don't
We
we've
agree
already
that
agreed to that,
linguistic
right? Like
quality.
the same the animal does, right? So the things that I attach to is sort of determined by my own subjectivity. And I
But
think
we
that
agree.
doesn't change. It doesn't change no matter how much reason you give somebody. The way that I attach to things and care about things and modify those things are all just the drives that I have to begin with.
I mean, would like look at it like this? Like, would you agree that an individual like a few hundred years ago would have been able, like, for example, with their application of a certain concept, would have necessarily chosen, let's just say, necessarily maybe, I don't know, religious flagellation because they couldn't bear with the guilt of doing something which they deemed to be immoral, like maybe they were like gay or something, and so what they decided to do was flagellate themselves in order to, as an act of penance, right? Like that
Yeah.
may be the concept they apply. Whilst in 200, 300 years later, that same individual with a much more developed conceptual framework would understand that to be the decision which does not actually reflect their desire to resolve their guilt, and they may actually see that the guilt is unjustified. Actually, there was no reason for me to feel guilty. Being gay isn't immoral, and this concept that I have misapplied to myself was a poor description of consciousness used to forward the desires of another, like
Well, I
the
wouldn't
church.
say it's a poor description of consciousness. I would say the fact that you believe that there's a God who cares about whether or not you're gay was false.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, yeah, but like that would be like something else, wouldn't it? I mean, you can say, like, for example, uh, I would say that, like, saying that it was immoral would be the poor description of, like, overall, like, that it's a bad thing, that it's overall bad to consciousness, that it's going to result in a bad negative attitude, a negative outcome rather.
Well, I mean, in those different scenarios, it's probably true that if you were gay back then, you get a lot more you know, shit from other people for being gay
Yeah,
than you
but
would
that's not
now.
like
So it
that's the
is
thing.
actually a different situation.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like, obviously, you can include that sort of shit. Like, obviously, if we want to talk about, like, the scenario of actually being gay and something like that. Like, but I think that's a different, like, that's a different position, isn't it? That's a different point. Like, what I'm saying is that our conceptual application is modifying our desires and our drives in relation to reality. Even if we kept everything the same, if we applied concepts different, reality itself shifts in the sense of we actually understand it differently, which then allows us to modify our desires and which modifies our desires and ultimately drives us towards a better path. And so, what I would argue is that the creation of categoricals is the attempt to use right reason in order to dictate our behavior so that we can create the greatest expression of desire, the greatest expression of subjectivity, and that requires the application of universals with each other, which ultimately creates the concept of a good life and eudaimonia.
Yeah, okay. So, Bo, you could even get to the situation where you say, if we're looking for whichever concepts are strong, like, I agree with more progress in the evolutionary sense in which you're talking about, in which concepts take over other concepts because they're more there's something a basic human being could grow into more than prior concepts, and so they end up taking over. Um, the thing is, I don't see where like the valuation of all values needs to come into this, because it could just be the case that the ultimate, like, because I think all these are power gated, and it just happens to be the case that humans, are pretty much the most powerful thing on this planet.
Well, I think it's
It
power related in general, even at the point of like
so
enunciation and
but my
validation.
point is but my point is that I think, like, the greatest expression of our pleasure might just be meat eating. It could just be the case that we're the happiest as a being without anything able to really stop us from expressing these great desires by eating meat. I think what really would be the question isn't whether it's right or wrong or justified or not. It's whether or not our empathy is more impacted by eating animals or not than the pleasure we get from eating animals. And I think these are just basic human drives, and we'll find out which concept is more powerful when we like explore them. But either way, what's going to win out is whichever one is the stronger basic desire.
See, I
But
disagree.
even then, that has nothing to do with what I as an individual, concepts that I've already grown into, right? I can't change my past, and the sort of nature that I have would tell
Yeah,
me
yeah.
what I'm going to experience the best of.
I mean, I can agree that, like, for example, your conceptual framework is like, the language is the limits of your world, quote unquote, that kind of understanding. But that our conceptual framework obviously develops and can categorizes the world in a new variety of ways, and we start to understand the world in differently. So it grows and becomes more complex. But you can't, like, just pop yourself outside of language. You can't just like write your own language. Oh, this is how it works. It's perfect, and
Sure,
so on
so
and
it
so
could be the case that the sort of being that I am
forth.
could never
But
transition to veganism as the greatest
yeah.
good for me.
So that would be the limitation of your conceptual framework. So, like, your reason was incapable of seeing that the expression of subjectivity, or reason at that time, was incapable of understanding that the greatest expression of its subjectivity relied upon a moral categorical that it could not have worked out. It's like saying, like, yeah, it's like people who understood Newtonian physics couldn't have come up with the theory of relativity at that time, because all the concepts necessary were actually dependent upon Newtonian physics, which hadn't actually come to existence yet, right?
What do
Well,
you
like,
want to do with all these people who keep saying they want to vote for an hour?
yeah, okay. I guess we'll just make closing statements, and then just like, yeah, and
They're restless down there in the chat.
I know, but I like how we just ignored them, like for like 20
I
minutes.
mean, I would be happy to continue on, but you know, within the context of maybe we shouldn't.
Yeah, I think obviously we can. Why don't we just make closing statements, and then and then
Sure,
we'll go to vote. I'm happy to go first.
go to.
So, um, yeah, so I'd say that the application of reason, right reason is freedom. So when we apply reason correctly, we are self-determining. In other words, we are acting in such a way which, accordance with our nature, is the best possible outcome. We are creating a scenario which we cannot help but desire. If we act otherwise, then we are acting in a way that is causally impacted by something other than subjectivity. So, like, we're doing something which ultimately harms us, we are doing something that we shouldn't want, and we are doing something that we don't want, but we are either unaware of or we can't do anything about it. What I would say in this sense is that veganism is the expression of freedom. It is the expression of self determination through reason. That when we understand the conceptual development of ethics, it's in relation, or well, conceptual development in general, it's an ethical concept. We develop concepts of behavior based around notions of recognition, which allows us to understand our consciousness and our psyche. We develop behaviors in relation to the world, which is how we metaphysically divest objects. And overall, our notions and how inferences and entailments even function epistemologically is dependent upon our respect that normativity and value equally reside in other agents. And I would assert again that value is essential to this. Because when I say value, I simply mean that they have equal capacity to say something that I am justified or not justified in acting in a certain way. In which case, if I try to kill someone and they say that I am unjustified, or they resist and they show active resistance, they are actively nullifying or even implicitly nullifying my assertion that it is good because they are valuing it as not good. So, what I'm saying in this sense is that universals are dependent upon this application between all agents, and so veganism as sentientism, the respect for all agents, requires that we accept that we have a moral obligation or ethical obligation to all sentient beings. Yeah.
Okay, I guess I'll finish off. My main contention with perspective philosophy, aka, is that um, I don't think reason is something that has anything to do with freedom. I think freedom is a misapplied concept here. I think it ends up begging the question to say that the correct way of application of reason, which should be the information about the world and how the world operates and the sort of logical inferences, have to do with also the way we desire. I don't think we need a universal desire or a concept of universal desire to move towards in order to use our innate drives that we have. It seems that we agreed that we have these drives that we are just given to us, and those drives will prioritize whatever it is they prioritize. Like at a basic state, we start as an infant with very basic desires, and those desires attach to things that bring around good consequences, such that if I'm hungry and something feeds me, that becomes a concept of a good thing. And then it is the application of linguistic concepts that allows us to categorize and discuss them and then talk about them temporally. But that doesn't mean that a certain way of expressing value is incorrect because it just happens to not give value equal value to everything that can evaluate. Like there could be somebody who is a homicidal killer such that that's the only way that they could really experience joy is if they go around killing people. I don't care the fact that they're equal evaluators to me, right? The fact that like their expression of subjectivity is the same as my expression of subjectivity doesn't really matter. I'm just going to stop them anyways because I always prioritize my own desires. I think everybody does that. If it happens to be the case that you feel this desire to express other people's subjectivity, then of course that's going to be your teleology. But if it's not, then it's not. And it's not a decision of reason that tells you that, or nor is it a incorrect evaluation to say that I want to be egoistic in this particular sort of way. So I don't see how we get to this obligation unless there is this thick concept of free will that we could just choose otherwise that are outside of our values. I know that perspective philosophy doesn't advocate this, but I feel like his position necessitates this in order to make any sense. And I don't think that sort of thick free will really can possibly exist, not the way that he describes it. So that's my position.